Wilner Gesslich, Wilner Teichen, Wilner Wälder, Berg und Tor. Etwas Neues, etwas bängt sich noch die Zeiten von Amor.
In 1994, my two sisters, Rose and Hannah, their husbands Jaime and Solly, and I visited Vilna after almost 60 years. We had to confront dreams with reality. I visited Vilna again with Priscilla and our grandson Asaf in August 2003. Originally, we left Vilna with our parents before the war. In Vilna, we left behind the rest of the family, comprising 2 sets of grandparents, 4 uncles and 4 aunts, who were brothers or sisters to my parents, and most were married with children and families. This is a story about Vilna, about life in Vilna, and what happened thereafter in both Vilna and Janishuk, where Priscilla's mother came from.
Due to illness, I was not able to go on the first trip. This time, I was glad to go and learn not only what Jack's family lost, but a little of my own far-off roots. My father, Harry Karfin, hailed from Lekovitz, which is in a mountain region bordering Slovakia, Romania, Hungary, and Poland. This is nearly 1,000 kilometers away from Vilna and difficult to reach. And anyhow, by the time the Second World War broke out, we knew of no family member living there. My mother, Ada, on the other hand, had one sister, Shimi, a husband and a family, living in Janishuk, a small shtetl 70 kilometers from Vilna. We heard from them up to 1941, and I wanted to see, if possible, what was left after the war.
I am 15 years old. At the age of 9, my parents took me on a trip to Austria. We went to Vienna, where my grandparents from my father's side used to live. The proposed trip to Vilna came to me as a surprise. I knew that my Saba and Savta were planning to go, and when they invited me, I didn't know what to expect, what we would do, what we would see, and exactly where we would go. And so we traveled to Lithuania. What made this trip very special was the fact that when I went to Vienna, I didn't have the privilege to go with my grandparents. And here, I was going to hear the story from the original source. Everything I saw and learned will stay with me for the rest of my life.
I'll start with the outbreak of World War II. Looking at the map of Europe, within the area marked in red, the dark brown part is Lithuania, with the capital Vilnius, which in my day was part of Poland. Looking closer at Vilna, now called Vilnius, it is 500 miles from both Berlin and Moscow. On September 1st, 1939, Germany invaded Poland from the west, and 16 days later Soviets invaded from the east, and they met on the Blue Line at the River Bug, so Vilna fell under Russia. On the 22nd of June 1941, Germany attacked Russia and Vilna was occupied by the Germans. Let's see the large city of Vilna by walking to the top of the hill of 3 crosses. Vilna has several medieval castles and palaces and many Catholic churches, being a Catholic country. Into the city, this is the old main street, Mickiewicz Street. I remember these cobblestone streets. The architecture of many buildings in the center of town is neoclassical, as in much of Eastern Europe, and quite pleasing. This is the presidential palace. We are approaching the University of Vilna, one of the oldest in Europe, where many of the buildings originally belonged to the nobility of Vilna. The faculties of theology and philosophy were founded by the Jesuits in the middle of the 16th century. Next door is a building in the shape of Napoleon's hat. When Napoleon entered Vilna on Tisha B'Av and saw all the Jewish activities, he is said to have coined the phrase Jerusalem Delita, or the Jerusalem of Lithuania. He asked why the people were so sad and even crying. They answered that their home had been destroyed. He asked, was it the fault of my soldiers? They answered, no, it happened 2,000 years ago. Napoleon then replied, only a people who honors its past has a future. Next door is a Jesuit church, and we decided to go inside. This is the church of Ostra Brom, connected to the wall which surrounded the city in medieval times. It was also called the Church of the Black Madonna. I used to walk under the arch where it was customary for men to remove their hats. One day in winter, my hat, which was tied with a bow under my chin, was ripped off because as a child I had forgotten to remove it. Vilna is full of Jewish landmarks. This notice is in 4 languages. It is outside the offices of the Jewish Community Center of Lithuania. Jews prospered in this area at the end of the 1800s to the extent that in 1897, 61% of the people were Jews. After the First World War, there were as many as 50 Jewish printing houses, and the Tarbut Hebrew School had branches all over. Official birth certificates were written in Polish and Yiddish. Here is the birth certificate of my father. It was reissued in 1923. The fact that he is a Jew is indicated by the heading that he is born Israeli. He was born in 1898. His name is Aharon David in Hebrew, and it is also written in Polish. Here is his birthday and the day of his Brit Milah by the Hebrew calendar and by the regular Gregorian calendar. And here is even the name of the Mohel. This building, discovered in 1990 during renovations, was a branch of the Jewish Colonial Trust, which ultimately became Bank Leumi in Israel. This is a storehouse now, but it used to be a Jewish theater. The famous play The Dibuk was performed here for the first time. In 1936, that is before the war, there was a violent anti-Semitic pogrom conducted here by members of the local population. The Choral Synagogue of Vilna, known as the Chor Shul, was the only one not destroyed by the Nazis, as they used it as a warehouse. The Great Synagogue and others were all destroyed. Let's have a look inside the Chor Shul. On this site stood the Great Synagogue. Next to it was the Strashun Library, which had 40,000 books. Looking at the painting of the Great Synagogue, which seated almost 3,000 people, I remember my father taking me there. Look at the stairs leading up to the enormous Aron Kodesh. And below are the numerous worshippers. Many famous names are associated with Vilna. The Vilna Gaon of the 18th century was one of the greatest spiritual and intellectual leaders who embraced Bible study, mathematics and science. In the cemetery restored after the war is the burial place of the Vilna Gaon, as well as the righteous Jews who had been converted to Christianity under threat, including the famous Graf Potocki. This plaque shows that Theodor Herzl, the founder of modern Zionism, visited Vilna in 1903. Nearby there is a building which used to be a convent. The plaque on the walls of the convent, inscribed in Hebrew and Lithuanian, shows 3 righteous Gentiles who saved Jews during the war. To remind us of the famous Jews of Vilna, we enter the Jewish Museum, also called the Greenhouse. Eliezer ben Yehuda, the father of the revival of the Hebrew language, studied in Vilna, where he acquired the secular education after his yeshiva studies. Zamenhof on the right was the inventor of Esperanto, the proposed international language. Here is a Hungarian stamp issued in his honor. Yitzhak Ben Tzvi, former president of Israel, fled from Russia to Vilna, where he became a leader in Poalei Zion. Zalman Shazar, former president of Israel, studied in Vilna from his high school days. Lippi Lipschitz, the famous sculptor. Sutin the painter attended Vilnius Art School. Yasha Heifetz, the violinist, studied in this conservatoire in Vilna. There were numerous pen club gatherings where writers such as Shalom Ash were the guests of honor. My father's brother Shlomo is in this picture as well. In 1931, there were over 3 million Jews in Poland out of a population of 31 million. 2.7 million spoke Yiddish or Hebrew as their first language. Here is a list of 85 organizations, research, scouts, business, trade unions, sports for the disabled, political, charitable, Zionist, artist, etc. The sign Jiddu means Jewish street or Yiddish gas. Entering the ghetto area, there is a plaque showing the big and small ghetto. On our first visit, before it was rebuilt, it looked like this. In medieval times, this was also a ghetto. Now we see the start of the ghetto near where the street of Katsavim, or butchers, used to be. In medieval times, Jews had to be innovative craftsmen in order to be allowed into the city. So this is, in translation, Glazer Street, where Jewish glassblowers were situated. In Yiddish Gasse, or street mentioned earlier, there is a plaque commemorating the 29th of October 1941. Through a notorious action of provocation, 11,000 Jews were taken to their death. This plaque at another place says that on this spot, on September 7, 1941, more than 2,000 Jews were collected to be sent to Panar for execution. This was the location of the Rudnitsky Gate on the edge of the big ghetto, from where the selections for Panar took place. The people knew that they might never return. Overlooking the whole place stood the big Catholic church, from where the local people could see everything that was taking place. The Jews tried to live a spiritual life up to the end. The Jewish theater, which is shown here after it was renovated, thrived in the ghetto. And here are some ghetto posters from those times. Hanukkah was celebrated. A library holding 100,000 books was advertised. A concert staged by the Jewish police. A health lecture was advertised. A sports campaign. And even a lottery for winter help. Plaque commemorating an uprising by 10 youths reading, "From the barricade on this spot, resistance fighters from the United Partisan Organization from the Vilna Ghetto on the 1st of September 1943, confronted with rifle fire a Nazi squad who came to liquidate the ghetto. The Nazis managed to tear through the barricade. A few of the defenders were killed. Amongst them was the leader of the barricade, Yechiel Scheinbaum. The organized resistance made use of various escape routes, including the sewage pipes shown in this model. A great leader was Itzhak Wittenberg, of whom they later sang,
Gesagt hat dann Itzig und durch wie a Blitz ist, zum Teut geht stolz der Kommandeur.
Nevertheless, the big ghetto was liquidated on September 23, 1943. The small ghetto had 11,000 people, 70 people to a room. It was liquidated in 7 weeks when everyone was taken to Panar. Ideology permeated the lives of the Jews of Vilna. Here in the restored cemetery are the mass graves of fighters from the Yiddish Bund organization who fell at the turn of the century in an abortive Red Revolution. 3 graves of violent political enemies are united in death. The extreme left-wing Yiddish Bund, the United Partisan Movement, and the right-wing Betar Jabotinsky followers. This is a joint grave of Wittenberg, hero of the ghetto uprising, murdered by the Gestapo in July 1943, and for a woman called Sheine Madeisker, who used to carry messages for the United Partisan Organization and was shot in June 1944. They speak of 6 million who perished in the Holocaust. 6 million is perhaps a number too big to absorb. Let's try. Suppose that instead of a tombstone for each fallen Jew, you took a brick and you build a road like this brick-lined street in Vilna. With 6 million such tombstones, you could pave a road 20 kilometers or 12 miles long. But since the suffering of so many is impossible to comprehend, please bear with me if I now speak of a much smaller number that has personally touched us. Now, what happened to our own family in Vilna? Permit me to go a little way down memory lane. We take a walk from our hotel in Zavalna and we pass the closed-in market where peasant women were still selling flowers, vegetables and berries, and milk from cans. We now approach the hill near Kolyova, down which we used to go snow sledding in winter. Our first home was opposite the big plaza in front of the main railway station in Kolyova Street. At the outbreak of war, it was bombed by German aircraft. It resembled this building. In this fine building, in later years, is where our business, a fancy hairdressing salon, was located. It was on the corner of Troka and Zavalna, and the metal statue was on the corner, and in the front, where my 2 sisters and I stood during the previous visit, it was supported by the Greek Atlantis figures, in Yiddish jokingly referred to as the Balvanis. The entrance to our last home in Vilna was around the corner, and there was a big courtyard with chestnut trees around which we used to play. After the cold winter, we used to go on holidays in summer to forest country, often near the Velaya River. We rented a summer home called a dacha in places like Ponar or Vellakumpia. While my sister Rose attended the Yiddish high school, this was the Charno Hebrew primary school which I attended. It is now a warehouse. My sister Rose attended the Yiddish Real Gymnasia. Inside the courtyard was where the Judenrat, or the Jewish Council, sat. Rose revisited the school. In the courtyard, this plaque says that on the 3rd of November 1941, they gathered 1,200 Jews for annihilation. Auntie Sora, my mother's sister, is the only member of our family who survived the Holocaust, because for many years after the war, she wandered up and down Europe looking for her children and relatives. She provided us with details of what happened. My sister Anita Harris, a professional librarian, catalogued the events. This was on Sora's DP, or Jewish Displaced Persons card. She and her husband Tevye had a grocery store in this building, which was rebuilt when we got there this time. Her husband Tevye was sent to Estonia in September 1943 and died in Stutthof concentration camp on December 31st, 1943, by being beaten to death. Her son Chaim heard about the partisans and asked Sora for money for a pair of boots to join the partisans in the forest. Chaim, being only 12 years old, she refused permission and regretted it all her life. Chaim and Sora's daughter Ita on the right died on March 27, 1944. They were amongst a group of children, some of whom were taken to Auschwitz and the others were taken to a medical facility in Krakow, where they were killed and their skin and blood used for experimental purposes. On the left is cousin Hanna Jacobsen, who in 1944, at the age of 18, fled with her boyfriend Dov Sacher to join the partisans near Kovna. Hannah's photo album was found in her old home and handed to the so-called Tolerance Center in Vilnius, where it was discovered by accident by Aaron Jacobsen, a Holocaust survivor and a cousin from her father's side. In the album is also a dedication from Dov to Hannah, written on the last day of Pesach in 1944. In memory of the days we spent together, may the picture remind you that you had a true friend. The album also had a picture of my two sisters and myself. They were captured and killed on October 2nd, 1944 in the 9th Fort in Kovno. On one of our dachas, there is Uncle Alta Jacobsen, the father of Hannah Jacobsen, my grandmother, Rose, my mother, myself, and my other sister Hannah sitting on the right on the ground. Alta Jacobsen died on September 17, 1944 in Kaiserwald concentration camp in Estonia. The burnt-out remains of his tanning factory stood for many years. Grandpa Rafuel with Grandma Sarah are seen here with the eldest son Shlomo, who graduated as a teacher, and my dad with the hoop, and the eldest daughter Fagel. They lived in this street. He was a roofer by trade and built many church roofs as well. My father's sister Bryna was an art and handiwork teacher. Before the war, she complained that because her brother was a prominent Bundist, she could not get a certain job she applied for. Bryna and my father's other sister Fagel and her son were put to death on a date unknown. Near to Grandpa Rafuel's house was this synagogue which he occasionally attended. He was quite liberal and had a great sense of humor, which he passed down to my dad. And right next door The remains of the synagogue which I attended with our grandfather on my mother's side, Benjamin Itzik Selechnik, whose books I used to borrow when I needed, say, a chumash. On Novgorod Street, in which many of the relatives lived, stood the Selechnik family bakery. It was on this corner on which a new building now stands. Working in this bakery with my grandfather were three of my uncles and my Aunt Reva. Uncle Simi, with Uncle Laser on the right of the bicycle, used to visit us on vacation. Sitting are my dad, myself, Rose, my mother, and cousin Hannah. Uncle Laser was sent to Kaiserwald concentration camp in Estonia, where he died on December 16, 1944. Uncle Simi, after whom our eldest son is named, is seen here with Rose, Hannah, and myself shortly before our departure from Vilna. He was taken with our grandfather, my mother's father, to Lukishka Square, where Lukishka Jail stands, where my grandfather was shot. Lukishka Jail is adjacent to a church. Simi was then forced marched to Ponar, where he used to visit us in summer. In Ponar on July 2, 1941, he was shot as seen on the list in the Jewish Museum. He is number 208. His name, Selechnikus Simonas, also appears in the Memorial Museum in Ponar. His daughter Meryl, born in 1939, died from hunger in the ghetto. The third uncle, Avramele, was mobilized in the Polish army in March 1939. He was taken as a prisoner of war by the Germans in December 1939 and sent to Lublin. There the Germans established a Judenlager by separating the Jewish soldiers from the others. On June 10, 1942, the Jews were taken to Sobibor. On the way, typhus broke out, and 300 POWs died, and the rest were exterminated at Sobibor. We do not know the date on which my mother's youngest sister Rivka and her husband Adolf Rubinson were killed, nor that of the little boy David Michael. My mother's oldest brother Mesha had his own bakery here at Pavlova number 16. It was burned down shortly after the Nazi occupation, and he was killed on September 12, 1941. Sora looked after his children in the ghetto. Let's walk in the beautiful Ponari forest with all its memories of family holidays. My dad on the left, in front of him my mother holding Hannah, and Rose and I on the ground. We now come across several monuments. We are trying to comprehend, as it says here, in the Ponar forest, from July 1941 to July 1944, the Hitler occupiers and their local helpers annihilated 100,000 people. Of these, 70,000 were Jews, men, women and children. In Russian and Lithuanian, they leave out the phrase local helpers. It was only after 1991, when the Soviet Union broke up, that the monument was split and that the Yiddish and Hebrew words were added. There are 7 such pits originally dug by the Russians for the storage of oil before the German invasion, which the Nazis converted into mass graves for the people who were shot there. Most of the information about what happened here is found in the diary of a Polish journalist, Władysław Sakowicz. He also wrote that the real business developed around the clothing and belongings of the victims, and wagons were used to come to collect the so-called merchandise. Towards the end of the war, orders were given from Berlin to burn the remains of the victims in mass graves to eliminate evidence. Another monument in Hebrew and Yiddish. After the war, the Soviets put up this monument in place of a Jewish monument to commemorate Russian victims. The wording is the same as the Jews used, mentioning the local helpers.
Leaving the outskirts of Vilna for the 70-kilometer drive to Yanushuk, we see lots of wooden houses with steep roofs to avoid the accumulation of snow in winter. On the way to Yanushuk, we see its Lithuanian name, Joniskis. When the Russian army would occupy an area, they sometimes would build a kolkhoz, which is a collective communal agricultural settlement. This is the remains of such an abandoned kolkhoz. At last we are there. We are looking around Yanushuk. Yanushuk is located around a big lake. We ask questions, and we have been told by a woman we saw near the church that next to the lake shore is the so-called Jewish cemetery. We start looking for it on the lake shore. And suddenly we spot this fenced-off area. We come closer and we read.
Auf dem Ort haben die Nazi-Rotzkin und ihre Mithelfer den 24. Juli 1941 grausam umgebracht, beerdigt 70 jüdische Männer. Heilig ist der Andenkung von die unschuldigen Korbanos.
On this site, the Nazi murderers and their local helpers on July 24, 1941, cruelly annihilated approximately 70 Jewish men. Holy is the memory of these innocent martyrs. We traveled further, looking amongst the reeds and the rocks, and we came across another fenced-off killing field. This one says, on this site, the Nazi murderers and their local helpers on July 24, 1941, cruelly annihilated approximately 85 Jewish women and children. Holy is the memory of these innocent martyrs. This looks like a peaceful village, and yet this was the end of the whole Jewish community, and amongst them my Aunt Shimi and her family.
Now we have told you the fate of 25 people very closely related to the family. What did we learn? Even a small number like 25 is a very big number if it relates to your own. Perhaps there's also something to learn for what must have gone on through the mind of the person who carved this out on the wall in the ghetto.
Als du gehst dem letzten Weg, Chotsch Himmeln bleiene verstellen bläue Tag. Kommen wird doch unser ausgewenkte Schor, es wird abbeugt an unser Trott für seinen Tod.